I know you want to move to Portugal, but the big question is, can you? Now, typically, there are two ways that we can think about being able to move to Portugal. The first is having an EU citizenship. So people from an EU country or an EEA country or Switzerland. So if you have French nationality, Irish nationality, Icelandic nationality, Swiss nationality, for example, then moving to Portugal for you is going to be fairly easy. If you don't have this, if you are an American, for example, if you're British, if you're Australian, if you're Chinese, if you're Argentinian, you're going to need to qualify for a residency visa. Now in this video, I'm going to look at the main residency visas and routes to residency. This is just a starting point. Each of these visas deserves an entire video on its own, but this will give you everything you need to know to get started and for you to think, hey, I could qualify for that visa. Now let's talk about the most popular residency visa, the D7. This is often called the passive income visa, the retirement visa, the non-lucrative visa. This visa is aimed at those with passive income. That's income you don't actively work for. Now, the most common example is retirement income. So for example, if you have a pension, that could be a private or a state pension, or you have US Social Security, for example, this is a good example of passive income. And it's also a good example because it's income that's paid out to you regularly, which tends to be another thing that the authorities like. Now, you may have worked at one point in your life in order to obtain this pension, but you don't actively work for it now. Other examples of passive income include dividends, interest from savings, royalties, or rental income. Now, what doesn't qualify, for example, would be a job because you actively work for that. And that includes a remote job. Previously, you could qualify for the D7 with a remote job or freelancing income. You no longer could. Savings typically don't qualify because they're a lump sum and they're not passive income that's paid out to you regularly, although maybe you could earn interest from the savings and that might qualify. The D7 is also suitable for those that perform religious functions. So for example, a priest or pastor or other type of clergyman. Now, how much money do you need to have to qualify for the D7 visa? This is where the visa really gets interesting. Now, let's hear a little clip from the experts.
The financial requirement is 870 euros per month, which is the Portuguese minimum wage.
As of 2025, an individual needs just 870 euros per month to qualify. So if you have a pension, if you have US Social Security, if you have rental income, for example, and this equates to 870 euros per month, you could potentially qualify. Now, you also need a year's worth of savings. Typically, when we talk about a year's worth of savings, we take 870 and multiply it by 12. A lot of lawyers suggest having more than this.
According to the information we have from some consulates, we advise to have at least 12,000 euros in the bank account because we saw an official list, I believe it was from Newark, where they advised 11,800 something.
However, this is typically a basic idea of what the minimum would be. Now, this figure is tied to the Portuguese minimum wage. So in 2024, it was 820 euros. In 2025, as we're recording this, it's 870 euros. It's likely to increase by, say, 50 euros in the following year and continue going up. If you want to check for the most up-to-date figures, simply click the link below. Now, what happens if you are not applying as an individual? What happens if you're applying as a couple, for example? If you have a spouse or long-term partner, you would need an additional 50%. So you would need 870 euros for yourself as of 2025, and you would need an additional 435 euros for your spouse or long-term partner. That brings the total to 1,305. And because the monthly requirement has gone up, that means the savings requirement has gone up. So now we need to multiply 1,305 times 12. And as mentioned, a lot of lawyers recommend having more than this. Now, what about children? If you have dependent children, and there is strict criteria about what qualifies as dependent children, but typically speaking, we're talking about children under 18 or perhaps a little older, but in full-time education. If you have dependent children, they would require 30% of the main applicant's income. So the spouse required 50%, now it's 30%. So that's an additional 261 euros as of 2025 per month that you would need. So also need to think about the savings requirement. This has gone up, so you need to add 261 times 12 to meet the savings requirement. As mentioned, lawyers always recommend that you show a little bit more. There's also support for dependent parents, although you would need to show that they're dependent on you, either sort of physically or financially. Now, let's hear a little clip from the experts.
They have to be your dependents, so they can't have. You have to show that you supply for them, that you're the primary caretaker, and this is easy for you to prove because if they are older than you, if they have no income or they have a low income and they depend on you, when you move, you of course have to bring them. So it's not as hard as people think.
Now let's talk about visa number 2, the digital nomad visa. This is the second most popular residency visa for moving to Portugal. Typically called the D8 or sometimes the D9 according to some consulates, but generally speaking, most people refer to it as the digital nomad visa. It is aimed at those who freelance or who can work remotely, basically people who have a form of income that they actively work for that comes from outside Portugal, so they're not reliant on a job in Portugal. Now, let's hear a little clip from the experts.
Actually, the world is digital nomad visa, but can be applicable to any profession. You can be a painter in Portugal or an artisan in Portugal, but if you are being paid by a foreign entity that is paying you and allows you to work here, this is also a digital. It's for all persons working remotely, being paid by a foreign entity, irrespective of the nature of the entity or the work. It can be a labor contract, you can be a service provider, you can have your own company. So it's the form, it's a little bit relevant.
Typically speaking, it's a residency visa, so like the D7, you're using this to move to Portugal and spend the vast majority of the year here. There is also a 1-year option as well. The requirements for this are now much harder than the D7. So with the D7, you need 1 times the Portuguese minimum wage. So we mentioned in 2025, that's 870 euros. For the digital nomad visa, you need 4 times this. So you would need 3,480 euros of income from freelancing or from a remote job per month. And this is taken as an average over the past 3 months. It also gets quite expensive when you start adding in a spouse or long-term partner or children. So typically speaking, the 50% rule for partners is used here. So you would need an additional 50% if you're bringing a spouse or long-term partner. You would also need an additional 30% if you're bringing a dependent child. So if you're bringing a spouse or long-term partner, you're adding an extra 1,740 euros per month. If you're bringing an additional dependent child, that would be 1,044 euros per month. There may be some flexibility depending on the consulate, as obviously this is quite a lot of money. However, don't necessarily bank on it. Now, the third and one of the most famous residency visas is the Golden Visa. Now, this visa is quite unique. It stands out from all the other ones, particularly because of the physical stay requirement. So this visa only requires you to spend an average of 7 days per year in Portugal to maintain your residency requirements. Other visas like the D7, the digital nomad visa, the employment visa, student visas, etc., they're expecting you to spend the majority of the year in Portugal. They're expecting you to make your life here. You can do that with the Golden Visa, but a lot of people choose not to. So it's a good option for those who are still working, for example. So let's say that you are working in the US and you earn decent money. You want residency in Portugal. You're thinking about moving there later, or you want to have those years qualifying you to later apply for a Portuguese passport. This is also an option for those who say want more flexibility. Maybe they need to spend more time in another country like the US, for example, or maybe they're planning on doing more traveling. They don't want to be tied down with the physical stay requirements that come with other visas like the digital nomad visa or the D7 or any of the sort of employment visas. So this visa, there are two main ways to qualify for it. You either invest or you donate. Naturally, most people invest because they want their money back and they want a return on their money, hopefully. So you typically would need to invest 500,000 euros, or you typically would need to donate 250,000 euros. Now, as mentioned, there are many different paths to qualifying for the Golden Visa.
You can create a business with 10 full-time jobs. You can apply for the Golden Visa through that. You can invest 500,000 in an existing business that creates 5 jobs. You can do a donation of 250,000 to the culture, the national heritage, and the arts. 500,000 into investment in scientific and technological research. And all those are options. My favorite one is to invest 500,000 into a fund.
Generally speaking, most people these days go for the investment in funds option. It's hands off for the most part. You put your money in, someone else manages it for you, and at the end of the term, you hopefully get to withdraw that with a return on it. Now, as mentioned, this Golden Visa is different to the other residency visas and it follows a slightly different rule. So the first and most obvious one is the physical stay requirement. So most visas assume that you're going to make your life in Portugal. You're going to spend the majority of the year here. The Golden Visa, on the other hand, only requires you to spend an average of 7 days per year here. And it is the only visa that allows you to do this. So that is unique because that allows you to continue working elsewhere, for example. So you could continue working in your high-paying job in the US or the Middle East, for example, come to Portugal for 7 days per year, which is just a vacation. Spending less than the sort of typical 183 days also means you can potentially avoid tax residency in Portugal, which isn't something that the other visas typically allow. However, all of this comes with some downsides, and obviously the biggest one is going to be cost. So the Golden Visa is going to run more expensive than the other ones, particularly when it comes to the government fees and legal fees. They aren't astronomical, but they're definitely higher than the other visas. I also think that you have to do more due diligence on this one. So you're investing your money. You have to do a lot of research. You don't have to do the same level of research when you're applying for the D7 or the digital nomad visa. Now, the next visa I want to talk to you about is the D2, sometimes called the entrepreneur visa. Some people call it the startup visa, but that's actually a whole other visa, which we'll get to in a second. This visa is aimed at two groups of people, really. So entrepreneurs, people who are going to start a company in Portugal, or independent service providers, people who are basically going to be freelancers in Portugal. So this is perfect for those who have that amazing business idea or who already have a business somewhere else and either want to open another branch or transfer that business to Portugal. So this visa is quite unique in that when you compare it to other entrepreneur visas, the requirements are a lot simpler. You don't need to create jobs, for example. You do need to be able to create enough income or enough profit in order for you to live off. But because the Portuguese minimum wage is quite low compared to other European countries, that amount is much lower. Officially, there's also no minimum startup capital requirement. However, if you're opening a guest house, for example, or anything else, you would need the amount of money that it would take to get that guest house up to scratch. Same goes for any other business. As with all of the others, you can bring a spouse, a partner, dependent children, but you would need to have enough income, or the business would need to have enough income in order to support them. Now, some caveats about this visa. A lot of people think this must be an easy option, particularly if they don't qualify for the D7 or the digital nomad visa. They think, I'm just going to apply for the D2 instead. I've always had this idea for an Etsy store or for a guest house or to open a shop or whatever. However, you shouldn't really look at this as a backup visa, and here's why.
Because the requirements are much more complicated and there is much more discretionary of the authorities to analyze and to verify if people comply or not with with the requirements of the visa.
When you apply for the D7, when you apply for a student visa, when you apply for the golden visa, it's pretty straightforward whether you qualify or not. For the D7, for example, you need 870 euros per month from passive income sources, and you either have that or you don't. With the D2, there's a lot more gray. So you're going to submit your business idea for your lemonade stand. The person on the other end, the person reading your application, they need to decide, one, is this lemonade stand going to make money? Is it going to be able to support this person, or are they going to become a burden on the Portuguese state? Is it going to be able to support their dependents? Second of all, is it something that we want in Portugal? Is it going to benefit Portugal in general? They have a lot more flexibility to reject this if they don't think it'll work, if you're not going to succeed and become a burden on the Portuguese state, or if they just don't think it's worthwhile. So generally speaking, a lot of lawyers will suggest that you don't apply for this, particularly if you qualify for another visa. And they will also suggest you don't submit an application for this if this is simply your backup option, because if it looks like that, there's a good chance it'll be rejected. Now, obviously, there are entrepreneurs out there, and you might be one of them. So if you have previous business experience, if you are buying a business in Portugal or investing into one, or you're transferring an existing business here, or if you just have a great business plan, if you have something that you think will work, you might not know it'll work, but you have a good business plan and you think this could work in Portugal, you think it could make money, then by all means apply for this visa. However, don't simply think of it as your backup option visa. Now, closely related to the D2 is the startup visa. So the D2 is a broader business visa. So if you have an idea for something like a guest house, it would go into the D2. If you have an idea for a startup, something that's innovative, something that's in the tech space, for example, you may consider applying for the startup visa, although you could also apply for the D2. This visa is really focused on bringing more foreign entrepreneurs who have innovative ideas to Portugal, and this is a big focus of the Portuguese government at the moment. You may know already that the Web Summit technology conference takes place here. You may have heard about the new NHR regime, IFICI, which has a lot of focus on startups and sort of highly skilled fields. This is a lot of what Portugal's focused on at the moment. However, the startup visa has more restrictions than the D2, and it's important to be aware of this. So for example, first of all, your startup has to focus on more innovative goods and services than is typically required of the D2. You also need to get approval from an incubator that will work with you. Your project or startup should have the potential to create skill jobs, and that is skill jobs beyond the people just applying. It should basically create jobs in Portugal. There are turnover requirements. So for example, your startup should aim to achieve a turnover of 325,000 euros per year or reach an asset value of this, so it should be worth that amount, within 5 years after the incubation period. Now, one good thing about this visa, one thing that's a little bit unique, is you can have up to 5 applicants on this, and those people don't have to be family, so it's a little bit unique from that point of view. You do need to show that you have money in the bank for each person. So as of 2025, you need 5,146 euros per person. And then there are specific visas as well that allow startup owners to recruit for their startup. So there is a tech visa. The D3 visa could also apply in this case, and there is also the D1 visa. We'll get to those as well. Now let's talk about visa number 6. This is the D3 visa. So this is the first of the employment visas. This visa is aimed at highly qualified individuals, and there is strict criteria on what qualifies as a highly qualified individual based on the sort of level of job that they're at, their qualifications, and also the industries that they're in. If you want to qualify for this visa, you will need to have a job offer or an employment contract from a Portuguese employer. You will also have to have a salary that is at least 1.5 times the national average salary or 3 times the social support index. That might sound confusing. In 2025, the minimum wage is 870 euros. So you would need 1.5 times that, or 1,305 euros per month. we mentioned the tech industry earlier. Now, specifically for the tech and startup industry, there's the tech visa, and this is visa number 7 on this list. As you can imagine, this is specifically aimed at workers in the tech and innovation sectors. This one is slightly easier than the D3, just barely, because your salary only needs to be 2.5 times the social support index rather than 3 times. However, it's more or less the same. Again, there are strict criteria on what qualifies for this, and as mentioned, it would need to be a job within the sort of tech or innovation sectors. Now, number 8 on this list is the D1 visa. This is a more general employment visa. So the D3 is for highly qualified individuals. The tech visa is for tech workers. The D1 is broader. Now, you will need to have a work contract for at least 12 months to qualify for this. And you will also need to, or at least your employer will need to show that they weren't able to find a suitable candidate in Portugal or from the whole of the EU. So just because you don't qualify for the D3, don't worry. That has very specific requirements, and it is for the industries that Portugal feels that it's lacking in. However, many people move to Portugal on the D1 visa as well. Unfortunately, like the D3 visa, this isn't a job seeker visa, so you can't come to Portugal and look for work. You need to go out there and look for companies that are willing to hire you. Option number 10. Be an EU EEA Swiss national. Easier said than done, right? So if you are already French, or at least have a French passport, or German or Spanish, Icelandic, Irish, etc., moving to Portugal is very straightforward. You come to Portugal. After 90 days, you register at your local Câmara Municipal to get your CRU. This is valid for 5 years. And the whole process is very straightforward. You do have to show that you can support yourself in Portugal, either through a job or savings or something like that, for example. But it isn't as strict as the visas for the people from the rest of the world. You can do it once you arrive here. You have the ability to get things like the NIF number once you arrive. It's much more straightforward. Now, obviously, if you've watched the start of this video, you probably don't have this option. However, there are people who have the possibility to obtain an EU passport. So for example, if you have Irish heritage, for example, and you may be wondering, do I do this first and then move to Portugal as a European? After all, it seems easier. Maybe. So I do think it's definitely, if you're able to get a second passport, it's always a good thing. And yes, moving to Portugal this way would be a lot easier. However, be aware that there could be backlogs and delays in getting your passport. So with Portuguese citizenship, for example, there's a lot of people in the US, for example, who have a Portuguese parent or grandparent. They could apply for a Portuguese passport, then move to Portugal on the EU route. It would be a lot simpler for them. However, the citizenship application could take 1, 2, or 3 years, whereas a visa application, something like the D7 or the digital nomad visa, that might only take a few months. So you have to weigh it up. Do I want to move to Portugal sooner rather than later, or am I happy to wait? And there's nothing to say that you can't do both. So, for example, you could submit your citizenship application now, have that going on in the background, but then you could apply for a visa like the D7 or the digital nomad visa, for example, move to Portugal. Once your citizenship from Portugal or whatever country is approved, then you can sort things out. But in the short term, this would allow you to move to Portugal earlier. Finally, let's talk about family members. So it's often the case that one person in a family, say the husband or the wife, has citizenship from an EU country or EEA country or Switzerland. So let's say that dad has citizenship from France. He's able to move to Portugal, no problem. He follows the system that we mentioned earlier, where he registers at the Câmara Municipal or town hall. He gets his certificate of residency, which is valid for 5 years. What about the other family members? Well, the good news is he can bring them too. So typically the qualifying family members are usually a spouse or a long-term partner and dependent children and potentially dependent parents. The way it works is this. The person with the EU citizenship registers at the town hall. They get their residency certificate. Once they have that, The other family members are then able to contact IMA to try and get an appointment under Article 15 for family reunification. This can be easier said than done. There has been big delays on this in the past few years. Some lawyers are now recommending that the other family members apply for their own visa rather than go the traditional route. Some are saying come to Portugal on this route, but be open to taking IMA to court later on in order to get an appointment. Now, let's hear a little clip from the experts.
You have to sue IMA at this point. For you to get Article 15 is what's happening now. You have to sue them to get the appointment.
But needless to say, it is an option. You obviously should speak to a lawyer to see what the right option is. And it does allow family members of those who have EU or EEA or Swiss citizenship to move to Portugal. And it is typically, or traditionally anyway, a much easier route into getting to Portugal. There is also an option for those who don't have EU, EEA, Swiss nationality, but are already living in Portugal. So if you're living on a D7 visa or digital nomad visa and you have, a spouse or dependent children elsewhere, they can potentially move to Portugal on the D6 visa as well. That's a slightly separate process. Now, one other way that you could move to Portugal is with a student visa, which, as you can imagine, is a visa that gives you the right to come and study in Portugal. The D4 visa allows you to come to Portugal to study a long-term course, such as an undergraduate degree or a postgraduate degree like a master's or PhD. And this can be a good way of moving to Portugal. You do need to get accepted by a university or institution of education, and obviously you will have international fees to pay as well. Cost-wise, international fees are definitely more expensive than what locals would pay, but you may actually find Portugal's international fees to be cheaper than other countries, and it may even be cheaper than the regular fees that you would pay in somewhere like the US or even the UK. However, even though the D4 visa is a good route to residency in Portugal, there are some things to consider. Firstly, the study visa, is typically only valid for as long as the course. So if you're on a 3-year degree, for example, the visa would be valid for around 3 years. That doesn't allow you to live indefinitely in Portugal. Yes, you can find a job after and transfer your visa to something else, but the study visa doesn't actually give you a huge amount of time after graduating to find a job, so you would probably need to start job searching early on at the end of your degree. You could also go on to a master's. There may also be restrictions on the number of hours you can work. Typically, this is around 20 hours per week, so it's not a work visa in disguise. Now, some courses are available in English, but this is typically the postgraduate courses. Obviously, the vast majority of them are going to be in Portuguese. Now, this is a fantastic opportunity for you to throw yourself in the deep end and force yourself to really learn Portuguese, but that first year is going to be pretty hard. Now, in closing, there's obviously a lot more to all of this than what I've talked about in this video. Each of those routes to residency requires their own separate visa. And there's a lot of questions, a lot of gray areas that come up with them. For example, should you be doing combined or separate applications if you're applying as a couple? What documentation is required? And this can vary depending on the actual consulate that you're applying through. But hopefully this has given you an overview. Hopefully there's been at least one visa that's jumped out and you've thought, maybe I would qualify for that. And if there hasn't been, please do get in touch at portugalist.com/chat to discuss your situation. There may be an option for you. And if you're ready to move to Portugal or you want to get the ball rolling, you want to know what documentation you should start gathering, please get in touch at that same link, portugalist.com/chat, and we can help you. We can help you get started on the process. If you have enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. That way you'll get more Portugalist content in your feed. I do hope that it has been helpful. So thank you very much and bye for now.